welcome everyone to this afternoon's coffee afternoon. I'm delighted to have some great speakers with us today, but not so pleased to be talking about this topic, although it's obviously one that we can't ignore. So today's coffee afternoon is going to be all about the cost of living crisis and the financial climate that we're currently in, and what impact that has or may have upon volunteering and the organisations that we work for. So a slightly gloomy topic, but I'm hoping that we'll come up with loads of ideas and ways to wade through the gloom in the session. So we're going to kick off with an introduction to the topic by Rob Jackson from Rob Jackson Consulting. So I'll hand over to him in a moment. But throughout the session, if you've got questions or you want to comment on what is being said, please do pop them in the chat. I'm also going to include a Pigeonhole link for you. And this is an external platform, so it will take you to another website, but it just allows you to upvote questions. So we will have a little bit of time for Rob to answer any questions you might have, but probably not enough to get to everyone's questions. So I do encourage you to use the Pigeonhole link, because if you see a great question in there and you agree with it, you can vote for it, and it means that we will go to that question first. So it just means that with the limited time, we will make sure we get to the questions that are most pertinent to you as a group today. So we will be doing that. We will break out into discussion groups a little bit later, and then we will introduce our second speaker, Sarah, a bit later on in the session, and we're due to finish at 4 o'clock. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Rob, and I will post the Pigeonhole link in the chat. Thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you, Rhiannon. Hello, everybody. Nice to be back with you again. Rob Jackson, Director of Rob Jackson Consulting Limited, and I sit on the exec for the Heritage Volunteering Group, so many of you will be familiar with me. I've spoken at a number of these events before. I just volunteered to kick this off today because I wrote a blog post a little while ago now, beginning to look at cost of living implications. Blog post came out at beginning of September, and we'll share that link with you in the chat in a minute. And really where it came from was, if you've not come across it before, the Association of Volunteer Managers has something called Voluntary Voice. And once every month on Voluntary Voice, it's like a social network. On Voluntary Voice once a month, I convene on the last Friday of each month at lunchtime a live chat for volunteer managers. So it's text-based. We don't tend to have Zoom or anything like that going on. And we have a theme, a topic, an issue that we want to talk about each month, and then we sit and we chat about that theme. Our keyboards catch fire, smoke goes flying off them, and then we post it as a kind of a transcript. And I took that transcript and turned it into a blog post around the cost of living crisis. So there were three things really that came out of these conversations with actual real life volunteer managers like all of us, that were at that point beginning to indicate what some of the implications of the cost of living crisis were. So I thought it might just be helpful just to share those with you as a bit of a kickoff and a discussion starter before you go into your breakout rooms. So the kind of things that we were hearing, the first area was around people scaling back or stopping their volunteering altogether because of the cost of living crisis, which on top of the fact that many organisations are struggling to recruit after volunteer numbers dropped during the lockdowns, is creating a bit of a perfect storm for some organisations in terms of recruitment and retention rates. The reasons why we were hearing from other volunteer managers about why people were stopping volunteering, well, there were quite a few of them, but I suppose the two main ones were volunteers not being able to afford to be out of pocket through their volunteering. We'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the importance of expenses, and that may be the claim rates not keeping up with the cost of living. So there's been some campaigns around, for example, increasing the mileage rate. It could be down to the speed at which expenses are offered. It could be down to the fact that organisations don't offer expenses at all, or the systems and processes that are used in doing it. So part of the reason people were reporting that their volunteers were stopping was down to just not being able to afford to be out of pocket volunteering anymore. And then one of the other big ones was volunteers having to prioritise paid work. So this was perhaps older volunteers who had retired having to take up part-time work again because the value of their pensions and the cost of living was value of the pensions decreasing, cost of living increasing, people who were already working one job having to take on second, third, fourth jobs on top of the existing work that they were doing. And of course, that then begins to squeeze out the available time that they have to volunteer. So one of those kind of the first big challenge that we were hearing about from people was just volunteer numbers. Recovery rates were already slow, after the pandemic. This was slowing them even more. And then existing volunteers who we'd kind of come to rely on, who'd come back from the pandemic or been recruited after the worst days of lockdown, were now having to scale back or stop their volunteering altogether. So this may be resonating with some of you. You may not have a problem on this. I'm sure it will impact your organizations in different ways and potentially in different roles as well. The second area that I thought was really interesting was organizations, volunteer managers reporting that volunteers who had switched either out of choice or because of the way that organizations chose to reconfigure their work during the lockdowns. So volunteers who'd switched to working from home were now increasingly becoming reluctant to continue to do so. In large part because of the cost of heating their homes, because of the cost of lighting their homes, because of the rising cost of things like broadband, all of those kinds of things were really kind of, particularly as we go into the winter and we go into shorter days, darker nights, it becomes more difficult for some of those volunteers to be able to afford to continue to volunteer from home. And that was raising all kinds of questions for us in the discussions we were having. So lots of different practice around organizational attitudes to reimbursing some of those costs for volunteers. How exactly do we work out a proportion of heat, light that the organization could justifiably reimburse? Does that fall within HMRC guidance, or does it run the risk of imposing tax requirements? All of those kinds of things were beginning to surface as a kind of topic of discussion. But the other side to it actually linked into these warm banks. So I'm sure many of you have heard of them, or warm spaces that were being talked about on the news this morning or yesterday. So increasing numbers of community organisations right across the UK, finding spaces in buildings which are already going to be open. So they could be libraries, they could be leisure centres, they could be community spaces that are already going to be open during the winter anyway, and using those as an opportunity for people to come together so that instead of having to stay at home and heat their house at home, which they probably can't afford to do, they can come into these community spaces, stay warm. Quite ridiculous that in 21st century Britain we're even having to talk about that. But some volunteer managers are beginning to think about, well, how can we use that as an opportunity? How can we use that as a recruitment opportunity? So if a museum or gallery is going to be open during the daytime through the winter anyway, why can't we pitch that as an opportunity? Come volunteer with us and stay warm during the winter, and you don't have to pay your own heating and electricity bills. So people were beginning to talk about that as a bit of an opportunity. Of course, it works on the assumption that organisations haven't permanently closed office space or reduced the physical space that they've got available during the pandemic. So an organisation like the Royal National Institute of Deaf People, for example, completely got rid of its head office during the pandemic. It now can't offer those opportunities for people in a head office because they don't own or lease a building that's available. So lots of different kind of perspectives on that, but people beginning to see it as a little bit of an opportunity. And then the third area that people were really talking about as an upcoming challenge, particularly for those organisations who run a April to March financial year, which may well be many of you, and therefore you're in strategic planning for next year, operational planning for next year, you're in budget planning, was how do we actually make a compelling argument to our organisations that they not only need to be budgeting for volunteer expenses next year, but they probably need to be increasing their budgets for volunteer expenses because of the cost of living going up. And that at a time when many finance managers, when many office managers are looking at the budgets, looking at their own heating and lighting bills for the building, looking at the cost of everything going up, and thinking, how are we going to cover all of those costs? We don't have an infinite amount of money available. And then you're going in there with an extra request around volunteer expenses as well. And that was a really challenging. I can't pretend that we came up with any easy answers on there. There were some practical things that we needed to be starting to look at doing. So are there ways in which we can reimburse our volunteer expenses more quickly? So can we use systems like VHelp, for example, to get expenses processed more quickly? Can we be a bit flexible so that instead of only relying on an online system, we can maybe revisit the idea of petty cash systems to get volunteers reimbursed so that they can get the money in their pockets a little bit quicker? how do we combat some of the culture of not claiming? So I was working with a group in the heritage sector just this morning who said many of their volunteers don't even bother claiming expenses. So we need to kind of try and challenge that, because then that means you end up with a two-tier system of those who can afford to be out of pocket and those who can't, being made to feel guilty. And then the final one, which was a big issue we talked about and certainly highlighted it in the blog as well, was really if we have to get tough with colleagues to make sure that budget's available, we need to draw people's attention to the fact that the provision of covering people's out-of-pocket expenses as volunteering is actually an EDI issue. Because if we're saying you can only volunteer with us if you can afford to be out of pocket, then we're deliberately excluding people. So if our organizations are really kind of championing an EDI and saying EDI is a priority for us, then actually to not provide sufficient funds to cover volunteer expenses could even go as far as laying them open to accusations of rank hypocrisy in that as well. So that wouldn't necessarily be our starting point in negotiations, but it would be a useful point to potentially point out the disconnect between what they say and what they do if they're not covering expenses. That was the conversation at the beginning of last month. I've not really heard a great deal else that's kind of cropping along. So in your discussion groups, you may want to reflect on some of those things, use them as a bit of discussion starter. Certainly share your current experience around volunteer expenses and how it's impacting, how the rising cost of living is impacting on your organizations. But I think it's quite clear to all of us who kind of stay abreast of current affairs, things are not going to get better anytime soon. This is something that was going to be with us certainly through this winter, more than likely through the whole of 2023 as well. And it's yet another thing from outside of volunteering that's coming and impacting on our work, and that we have to be prepared for and thoughtful about in how we deal with it. So I hope that's a useful introduction, Rhiannon, and I hope it's prompted some discussion from people as well. Happy to take any quick questions before we move into the breakout groups.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Rob. A really great overview, and some of it may not be rocket science, I guess. Some of it you might have known already, but hopefully what this session will do is to prompt some responses and how we might think about it. So please do use the pigeonhole to flag any questions. I know that I can see Polly has a question for a moment though, so we'll break with tradition, and if I can ask you to unmute, Polly, and to say your question.
Thank you so much, Rhiannon. It's actually a comment and a follow-on from Rob said. Rob, thank you so much. That was really, really useful. The Heritage Alliance is working with Historic England to gather anecdotal information about the impacts on cost of living, to create a sort of information hub, which we can then use to pass on to DCMS. Obviously, that doesn't negate other people getting in touch with the government, giving your own evidence across. But we are working with Historic England in this instance to gather that information. And that's not just from our members at the Heritage Alliance. We've been asked specifically to go out to the entirety of the heritage sector. So I've taken some of your points there. I'll be reading your blog to get that information, but it would be great. I'll put my email in the chat in a second. If we could hear from people, if you're happy to share your anecdotal information, that'd be fantastic. Or if you've got questions about under what understanding we're going to be sharing that information with HE and with DCMS, I'm happy to answer those as well. But sorry to sort of hijack that slightly, Rhiannon. I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
And it's a nice way of also kind of trailing the fact that at HVG conference, which Rhiannon will talk about at the end of the event, we've also got Sean from DCMS coming along as well, so people will be able to put questions to Sean directly on these kinds of things. So that's great. Thanks, Polly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you hugely for that, Polly. It's always great to have extra bits in there. We haven't had a huge amount of questions so far, so I think what we'll do is I'll ask the one question I posted, and then we'll go into the breakout rooms, and hopefully that'll inspire a few more questions once we've had a bit of time to grapple with the topic. And actually it's a little bit of a follow on from Polly, and it's really to ask kind of what some of the main advisory bodies like NCVO, like HVG, what they are doing at the moment to support organisations through these issues. Is there anything? Is there something that we need to do more of to encourage them to?
Yeah, so I think some of them, and the NCVOs, NAVCAs, and others, because obviously this isn't just an English issue. This is a UK-wide issue, and it's volunteering's devolved across the UK. Some of them have been involved in lobbying government and trying to get MPs from all sides of the Commons to ask questions of the relevant ministers, which they seem to have come up with a party line that they don't tend to vary from in their answers, which is quite unhelpful, because it basically says you can claim more than the mileage allowance, but they fail to recognise that that means tax liability could kick in. I think just events like this and giving people an opportunity to share experience, particularly given, I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be one of those last points that I made about how do we convince our organisations to do this? This is not a problem that we are going to solve by only hoping that some funder somewhere else is going to fund us to cover expenses. If volunteering is actually really fundamental to the way that we go about what we do, whether you're a bigger organisation like a V&A or a science museum, or you're a really small community organisation, actually putting your money where your mouth is, proportionate to how much money you've got, is really, really important. And making that argument to colleagues and supporting each other is, I think, one of the best things that we can be doing. And I can see Tamsin and others are putting information in the chat. But the more we can kind of collect the stories and the narrative, as Polly was saying, around what's going on, whether it's through HVG or other bodies, the more realistic picture we can paint. Government do not want volunteering to decrease. You know, the NHS, Teresa Coffey's asked for 1 million more volunteers this winter over the NHS, for the NHS. So you can't, they can't do that and then ignore the reality. Well, I suppose they probably can, knowing them, but in theory, they can't do that and ignore the reality of what's happening on the ground.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rob. We've had a few more questions come in, but they are around sort of expenses and some of the kind of the barriers around that. So I think what we'll do is we'll leave those until a bit later, because we're going to focus in on that particular issue in the second part of the session, and we will come back to those questions. So I think for now, if we move into the breakout part of the session, Rob, are you happy to introduce the questions that we're going to be asking people to think about?
Yes, so I just need to get the right document up. So what we want you to do, we're going to put a link to a Jamboard in there as well, so you can make notes on the Jamboard as you go through. Hopefully somebody in each group will know what they're doing with the Jamboard. So there's 3 questions we would like you to think about. We'd like you to discuss what you feel are currently or are going to be the most pressing concerns for your organisation, your volunteering setup. So what are the kind of top 3 for each breakout rooms around cost of living? What are going to be the biggest issues, the biggest concerns? What do you think will be the impact of those top 3 concerns on your organisation, your paid staff and your volunteers? And then the third one is, what ideas and suggestions do you have to mitigate these concerns and reduce any negative impact? So what are the concerns, issues, top 3 for your group? What are the likely impacts going to be on your organisation, your staff and volunteers? And what ideas and suggestions do you have to mitigate those concerns and reduce negative impact? And they will all be available as questions on the Jamboard as well.
Lovely. So I've popped a link into the chat with the Jamboard. You will need to open up that link, or one of you will do in your group before you go into it, as it won't be available in the chat when you get into your breakout room. So we're going to give you 10 minutes to have a chat about this. Obviously, introduce yourselves, check that you know who each other are, but see how far you can get with those questions. And then what we'll do is we'll invite you back in, and we're going to take some of the top ideas from everyone before we then look a little bit more specifically at the expenses issues. So you will very shortly see a little request come up in the corner of your screen asking you to go into the breakout room. I could ask you to follow that, and then you'll see a countdown timer at the top letting you know how much time you have left. So go forth, discuss. Welcome back, everyone. If we could ask you to pop yourselves back on mute again. Zoom does like to play with the mute function in between locations, just to keep us on our toes. All right, I'm going to hand back to Rob, and we're hopefully going to get some top line feedback from you before we move to the last segment of the session.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Rhiannon. So who would like to kick us off? Has anybody got anything they would particularly like to reflect back from the conversation that you were having? Too many windows open yet again. Just raise your hand. Tamsin, you've got your hand up. I saw your hand first, so go for it. Thank you.
For everybody else that was in my group, so Jennifer, Stephen, I'm looking around and squinting now, so apologies if I've missed somebody else out. Vicky, so we didn't even get past the issues, so we just talked about the fact that increasingly we're seeing people claim funds, and what does that mean for the rest of the budget for the rest of the year? What does that mean? Do we stop volunteering? We've also talked about the fact that our own organisations can't be a warm hub because they're turning the heating off as well.
Yeah.
And whilst paid staff will find it difficult to heat or work from home, volunteering from home is even more of a potential issue. So we just talked about the two things you said, and then we've highlighted potential issues that should be on the horizon, which are around the fact that there might be restructures around volunteer managers down the line in terms of redundancies. Also that we're firefighting so much, we actually don't have the time to think about mitigations and contingencies around all of this. So to find anything that would help us ring fence that and come up with a plan enables us to be better able to respond to all the variables and all the change that are happening all the time. But that's all we got around to talking about.
Brilliant. There was a lot for you to get through in a very short period of time. And it is worth saying that HVG were involved in some work that I did in the spring of 2020 when we were in that first lockdown to kind of preempt the likelihood that cuts and change were coming down the line, and to produce a letter to advocate for the strategic importance of volunteer management, which we then updated in 2021. And you can find all of that available for free on the homepage of my website. So I've just put the link in the chat. If you scroll down to the bottom of the homepage, you can find the Cuts and Change ebook. You can find the open letter that HVG and others were signatories to really kind of influence senior managers about why volunteer managers need to be invested in at the moment. So that was great.
Thank you. And just to say, please do keep adding to the Jamboards over the course of today, because I think I think from that comment from Tamsin alone, what we've absolutely realised is there's a lot to process for all of us. And as HVG, we can look to see what more we can do to support you using your comments. Please do keep adding to them as we go on. Any other comments or thoughts?
Anybody got anything else that they want to feed in? I know there's a lot and it's quite overwhelming in there.
I guess we kind of touched on very similar points. I guess we were talking a bit about the kind of complicatedness of how to effectively manage remote volunteering and how to best support people who aren't physically in our spaces, as well as if we are looking to contribute or support them financially during that time, how do we manage that? Especially if volunteers are international as well, which isn't our case but was the case for someone else in our group. And then I guess I was talking a little bit about volunteers generally not having the kind of time, energy, financial ability to prioritize like unpaid work above paid work, although of course it's not what volunteering is, but then kind of about our obligation as volunteer managers to effectively manage that and to give solid benefits that make volunteering still worth it, despite the fact that everyone might not have the ability to do it quite so much as they used to. And the kind of worrying aspects of that in organizations that rely on volunteers, how do we contribute enough to them and help them gain enough that they still want to contribute their limited time to us?
And make that distinct, I think, from the benefit that we offer paid staff as well, because there's a real danger coming into this that we start to reignite job substitution discussions at the same time. So organisations are looking at volunteers as a way of saving money, which we know they're not. So how do we make all of that distinctive so we don't open that separate can of worms? Thanks, Ren. That's really, really good. Matt, you've got your hand up.
I mean, I think obviously the news is, everything that's going on is hugely depressing, but I do equally think there's an incredible opportunity for us, both as leaders of volunteer engagement and our organisations as well, to use the cost of living crisis to reposition our volunteer programs and organisations at the heart of our local communities. And I think that's by kind of understanding local needs, providing what you were talking, Rob, third places, places for people to come and connect with our organisations, but also, you know, when they're here, to provide them, you know, with kind of well-being opportunities to develop and learn new skills, and you know, respond to their needs, but equally really put our organisations at the heart of the local community. And I think in so doing, thinking about volunteering and how our volunteer programs can help build political capital for our organisations. And that's going to be really important in terms of the conversations that our directors might be having with local councillors, local MPs around kind of accessing funding and kind of long-term organisational security as well. So I would really see this as a, you know, yeah, it's a depressing, you know, subject, but as an opportunity to really serve our communities more effectively and to put volunteering at the heart of our communities and our organisations.
Absolutely. Really good points, Matt. I'm mindful of time and our schedule, Rhiannon. All I will say is I know some of you asked questions in the pigeonhole or whatever it's called that Rhiannon shared. I have tried to answer a couple of those questions that I was able to answer myself in a response to those. But as Rhiannon said, please do keep the Jamboard going. Please do keep feeding this stuff through to us at HVG, because it's really important to help us to understand how we can support you. So I'm going to shut up at this point and hand back to Rhiannon.
Perfect. And you read my mind, Rob. I'd literally written that in the chat that you were answering questions, and we'll come back to any unanswered ones at the end. But we are going to move on to focus a little bit more on the topic of expenses, because that is, I guess, a really tangible area that might be hit by the current financial crisis. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who has been doing a little bit of research on this. I will leave Sarah, if you're okay, to introduce yourself fully, and then I will get your slides lined up. So thanks ever so much, Sarah, for feeding in.
Thank you, Rihanna. So yes, I'm Sarah. I'm the volunteer coordinator at Harewood House. Unlike Rob, this is the first time I've been presenting to HVG, so please bear with me. If you haven't heard of Harewood, we're based in Yorkshire. We are a historic house. We're also an educational charity, and we're very fortunate to have around 200 volunteers. So if I can just wind back a bit and explain a bit of the context about why this research has happened, why we undertook it. We conduct an annual satisfaction survey amongst our volunteers, and this spring, what one or two were saying to us, that they felt post-COVID that the asks of our volunteers was increasing. We were demanding more from them, but at the same time they could see that some of their tangible benefits were being eroded. And so I didn't really know how to answer that, because I didn't know what any other historic house or similar organisations and museums, what their policies were. I just had no idea. So I couldn't look them in the face and give them the answer that they wanted. So I started off thinking, who could I contact regionally within Yorkshire? And I came up with a very simple survey. And actually it took off, and a really big thanks to everybody who contributed to the survey. And in the end, we received responses from 31 organisations, and it was a really good cross-section. We had local authority run museums, we had historic privately owned houses, we had nationally funded museums, so rural locations or city-based. So we had a really good cross-section to get a feel of the benefits that volunteers were receiving. So hopefully, can you see the slide? Can you all see the slide? So what were the headlines? What was coming out of this? Yeah, there we go. So that shows some of the what I've talked about, the context, and then the research. It was taken in the spring of 2022 this year. So the headlines, actually 81% of the 31 actually do pay travel expenses. And I had a little look at the 6 that didn't, and I couldn't find any commonality. They weren't all local authority run museums, they weren't all city-based museums, they just were all very different. So I couldn't get any correlation there. Then I had a look at the amount per mile paid, and this ranged from 25p to 47p, but the majority, almost 2/3, do pay the 45p, which is in line with the HMRC guidance. But I don't think that's changed since about 2010, 2011. So it's a very long time since that's been updated. Quite a few, well, the majority have a cap on the amount of expenses they pay per day. But here there wasn't an overall consensus. Some capped it at just £5, whereas at the top end, there were some were capping at £18. So, and at the time in the spring, this was really before the cost of living crisis was really taking off. Fuel prices were starting to go up, but at this point, over half were considering reviewing the policy. So I think it'd be interesting to know whether this year, in the last 6 months, anybody has made any changes. We've looked then at other benefits, tangible benefits that the volunteers receive here at Harewood, and we're looking about being allowed to bring in visitors with them. So again, we found a significant amount of museums, organisations allow their volunteers to visit on days when they're not volunteering and bring in with them guests. And again, it was either 1 guest, 3 guests, or unlimited. There were some that were really quite generous policies in this area. And the third area we looked at were the discounts offered in shops and cafes. And again, nearly 3/4 offer a discount in the shops, we found, and 53%, just half, in the cafes. So I never thought I'd be able to say this, Rihanna, but next slide, please. So we, later on in the summer, we did a supplementary survey, and this was about subsistence. We didn't cover that area in the first survey. Slightly less number of respondents, 16 this time, and we found that a much smaller number actually pay a subsistence allowance. So only 4 of the 16 respondents, and again, 3 of them were under £6 and 1 was unlimited. So I have found this information really quite useful because it has given me the opportunity to benchmark our policies against other organisations and to find out where we were in line and where we were an outlier. And this has given me some hard evidence, because I know how challenging the next year's budget rounds are going to be, but this has provided hard evidence that where we are less generous and we are an outlier. So we presented this paper to senior management, which will then hopefully go as part of the next budget cycle, and we hopefully will see some improvement in the areas where we were less generous. And obviously we'll be reporting this back at our next all-volunteer meeting. It's quite interesting to be able to look at the data in the round, because it could be that an organisation doesn't pay expenses but has a really generous policy in terms of allowing the volunteers to come and visit and bring the guests. And in the current climate, it's maybe worth posing what is most important to them. Is it the fact that we can provide a space that they can come for free and with the friends and enjoy? Is that important to them, where they've got to go? If they wanted to go out for a day somewhere else, there'll be a cost involved. But if they can come to our organisations and enjoy a day with their friend, do they value that? Is that more important than having their costs, their travel costs reimbursed, or a subsistence allowance? And I think you do need, as an organisation, to look at all the benefits. We've focused very much on tangible benefits. I think there is as well, there are other things that we provide for our volunteers, of which helps with their mental and health and well-being, again, which also fits into this bigger picture. I think that's all I want to say at the moment, before we perhaps go back into breakout groups again. Is that right, Rihanna?
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think that gives us a really interesting picture of the sector and kind of what is the current practice. We're not going to go out into breakout rooms anymore, but we would love to hear any kind of initial thoughts that people have on that research, and any reflections that they might have. And I think the question for me is, what is missing potentially from that research? Would it be useful to conduct something like this again in the current climate? So yeah, I think any general thoughts would be really useful to hear. So if you could raise your hand, either using the raise hand function or literally raising your hand, that would be fab, and we can see what thoughts there might be from the room. Annette, be great to hear from you.
That research was really interesting, and it's given me some things to think about and to talk to my colleagues about. But what I was wondering about, another question could be asked, is what combination of benefits you offer? Because so we have a range of benefits we offer volunteers. So you might have more of one thing but less of another. So in our organisation, we give 50% off in our cafe, and we give a discount on cinema, and then we give 30% off in our shop, and then we give parking expenses, but we don't offer travel and we don't offer subsistence. So that's a question that was interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I guess the context of each organisation is going to have a slightly different variety of benefits. Do you have any sense, Annette, of kind of which of those goes down best with your team? Anything that they would like to see instead?
They really like having the cafe discount because it's quite a generous one. It's a very noticeable benefit. I think they would like to be able to bring guests for free to exhibitions, which we don't do. They can come to the exhibition for free, but their guests can't. So that's one I would, and also free cinema tickets, I think would be another nice one to give.
Brilliant, yeah. Thank you. And any thoughts, Rob, on what you've just heard?
No, I think all of those things are absolutely fine, and I think it's absolutely right that we should be looking at what are the benefits, what do the volunteers want, what works for them. The only caution I would put around it is that that's a conversation with your existing volunteers. What about people who aren't existing volunteers who you want to bring in? So particularly if you're looking to diversify your volunteer base in any way or reach out to new audiences, are those the kinds of things that they're going to be looking for? Or are they going to be looking for something that's a bit more tangible, like reimbursement of parking or mileage or something like that? And if they are, great, but how open are the rest of the organisation to them making those kinds of things available? It's that classic thing, isn't it? Most of us are volunteer managers. Most of us are working in roles where we can see what needs to happen, but we've got to convince somebody else to make that change. And it's quite easy for a finance team to kind of go, oh, well, it's all right for, a couple of free tickets to events or a 15% discount on a cup of coffee in the shop versus actually hard tangible cash that needs to be made available. So I just think about what's needed for that kind of broader audience that you might want to engage. But all sensible suggestions people are making, yeah.
Lovely. And from my perspective, I guess I'm from the old guard of volunteer managers. When I was starting out in this area, people were very cautious about this variety of benefits, I think, thinking of them as in-kind payments and how, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, Rob, whether you've got any thoughts on that, because obviously some of those ideas are really creative, but they make my old bones a little nervous, I guess.
Yeah, and if I was a lawyer here, which I'm not, I'd be telling you, oh, don't offer things of material benefit, don't offer things that may be counted as, in legal terms, what's called consideration, because it'll mean you've got contracts of employment with your volunteers and then you're really up the creek without a paddle. But I think, we've got to be realistic and look at, most charity shop networks, the volunteers get either first pick of the donations or a bit of money off. National Trust have offered free membership to volunteers in return for a certain amount of time for years. There's loads of organisations that do these things. You need to be mindful that if you have a really serious breakdown in relationship with a volunteer, to the extent that they want to take you to a joint employment tribunal to prove that they're an employee and therefore entitled to a whole bunch of rights, these things can come come back to bite you in the butt as a consequence. The simple solution to that is don't discriminate against people because they're volunteers. And as Matt's just said in the chat and others have said, is put the risk in perspective. It's risk management, not risk avoidance. So treat volunteers properly, practice good volunteer management across the organisation, and the risk that something will go wrong is far, far lower. The only practical thing to be aware of, and it was interesting with the research that Sarah was talking about, where I think you mentioned, Sarah, a 47p mileage rate, is you're quite right, that 45p rate's been in place for years and years and years. But HMRC are really clear that if you ever reimburse people above that minimum, that can incur a tax liability on those individuals. That's not an organizational tax liability, that's an individual. So that's just, you know, don't pay flat rate expenses for food and travel, use the actual rates that are provided, but don't go above those rates and you're far less likely to have problems.
Thank you for that, Rob. I think that's a real kind of tonic for me to be more creative than perhaps I've been in the past. So thank you. We are rapidly running towards the end of the session, but I want to ask the top voted question to Rob. So you're going to have to give a succinct answer here, Rob, because time is short.
That's a challenge.
Yep, absolutely. I'd like to challenge you at the end of a session. So if organisations are thinking of promoting themselves as warm hubs, how are they supporting staff so they feel confident welcoming volunteers in potentially desperate situations?
That is a really great question. The quick answer is I don't know, because I've only heard anecdotally that organisations are thinking about it, not that they're doing it. But I think it's a really important point. It's a bit like doing criminal record checks. Lots of us do criminal record checks, but how many of us have been trained in helping people deal with emotionally unburdening themselves about convictions from years ago? Most of us probably haven't and have probably never encountered it. So I think if you are going to look at doing that as an organisation, then you do need to make sure that the staff are properly trained and, really importantly, properly supported in doing that as well.
Lovely, thank you, Rob. Very succinct. Tamsin, did you want to come in with some last comments on that question? I know you've written some great comments in the chat.
I just think it is a really important area. I think there are resources available that you could look at. You know, if you Google trauma-informed practice, emotionally laden work, I think what's really clear is that you have a direct and open conversation about what happens if. So it's almost scenario planning so that your volunteers as a minimum feel comfortable knowing what to do if they're presented with a particular situation, and that they will be safe and they will be supported and backed up. Other organisation I would just highlight is Cruise. So Cruise has a huge range of information around bereavement, and essentially everything we're going through here is about loss. It's about loss of identity, loss of future, and that's the palpable emotion people are going to be feeling.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tamsin. Wow. Well, I think we could keep talking about this topic for the next 6 months of Coffee Afternoon. So we will, as a committee, have to think about how we do kind of pick up this conversation and continue to talk about it. But I'm afraid I am going to have to draw the session to a close there, as we're 1 minute over 4 o'clock. I'm going to hand over quickly to Matt, who's going to do a quick plug for our next events, and then I'll wrap up.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Great session today. Really great conversations. Yeah, we've got the conference coming up in the not too distant future. I think it is now less than 4 weeks away. So I'm going to pop a link to the conference ticketing in the chat for you, and you can get your tickets there for £25. It's 2 days on the 8th and 9th of November from 9:30 till about 1:30 in the afternoon. So we've got Sean from DCMS is coming along to open the event for us. We're then going to have a selection of workshops where you'll be able to connect with colleagues right the way across the sector, and we're going to have some panel discussions as well. We're also going to be presenting our Volunteer Leader of the Year award, which we've been doing every year for the last 5 years, I think. So if there is anyone you'd like to nominate, or you'd like to nominate any of your volunteer supervisors or anyone in your organisation, again, you can get the link in the chat that I'll post in a minute. It's on the same page as the conference website stuff. And then just one last little plug for me is obviously we've been talking a lot about kind of expenses and needed to maybe change the way that our organizations think about expenses. We've just started a new series on our YouTube channel called Recommended Reads, and so there's a video on there about effective decision making and involving volunteers in your decision making structures within your organization, which of course could potentially help remove some of those barriers to paying expenses. So I'm going to pop a link to that in the chat for you as well. And I think that's it, isn't it, Rhiannon? Have I missed anything off?
No, that's great. I really do come along to the conference if you can. Last year's was brilliant, and it's always much more interesting to have a broad range of attendees with loads of different examples under their belt.
Should say it's online, shouldn't we, Rhiannon? That would be useful to tell people. Yeah, it's online, people. Come along. Dead easy.
Very easy to attend.
Yes.
For that reason, though, we won't be meeting in November for a coffee afternoon or an EDI open forum. We will convene again in December, so second week in December, and it will be a little bit of a reflection over the past year, a little bit of kind of HVG stuff, but most importantly, a Christmas quiz. And Christmas jumpers are required but not obligatory. So yes, we hope we will see you at either of those two events. We will wrap up now. Keep adding, as I said, to the Jamboards throughout the day, and we'll have a look as a committee what we want to do to pick these threads up to support you going forward. We are going to go straight into our HVG EDI open forum. So I'm going to close this down now, and you will need to go and grab the other link for that session, and we will see you online in a minute or so, anyone who's coming to that session. Thank you so much for coming today, and we'll see you hopefully at the conference. See you then, everyone. Take care.
Folks.